For centuries, France has ravaged the continent of Africa, leaving a trail of destruction and devastation in its wake. The colonial powers of Europe saw Africa as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, a land to be conquered and plundered for its riches. France was no exception to this rule. From the 15th century onwards, French explorers set sail for the shores of Africa, eager to claim their share of the continent's wealth. They established colonies and trading posts along the coast, using their superior technology and military might to subjugate the native populations. The French justified their actions by claiming that they were bringing civilization and progress to the so-called Dark Continent. They built roads, schools, and hospitals, but these were nothing more than a facade to hide their true intentions. Behind the veneer of benevolence lay a brutal system of exploitation and oppression. The French forced the African people to work on plantations and in mines, extracting the continent's natural resources for the benefit of the colonial masters. They imposed heavy taxes and tariffs, driving the local economies into ruin. They suppressed any form of dissent or resistance, using violence and intimidation to maintain their grip on power. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of French colonialism was the way in which it sought to erase African culture and identity. The French imposed their language, their religion, and their customs on the native populations, erasing centuries of history and tradition in the process. They banned traditional African languages and forced the people to speak French. They destroyed sacred sites and artifacts, dismissing them as primitive superstitions. They imposed Christianity on the population, demonizing indigenous beliefs and practices. In doing so, the French sought to create a docile and compliant population, one that would serve their interests without question. They sought to strip the African people of their dignity and their humanity, reducing them to mere cogs in the colonial machine. And yet, despite all of this, the African people resisted. They fought back against their oppressors, waging wars of liberation and seeking to reclaim their independence. They formed political movements and underground organizations, working tirelessly to overthrow the colonial yoke. The struggle was long and bloody, but eventually, the tide began to turn. In the 20th century, African nations began to gain their independence, throwing off the shackles of colonialism and asserting their right to self-determination. But the legacy of French colonialism still lingers. The scars of centuries of exploitation and oppression run deep, and the effects are still felt to this day. The African continent continues to struggle with poverty, corruption, and political instability, all of which can be traced back to the legacy of colonialism. France may no longer hold formal control over Africa, but the damage has been done. The continent has been scarred and wounded by centuries of exploitation and abuse, and it will take generations to heal. So as we look back on the history of French colonialism in Africa, let us remember the suffering and the sacrifice of the African people. Let us honor their resilience and their courage in the face of overwhelming odds. And let us never forget the lessons of the past, lest we repeat the mistakes that have brought so much pain and suffering to the people of Africa.